radio.com. Jason Offutt is an author and paranormal enthusiast. His paranormal books include What Lurks Beyond, Darkness Walks, Shadow People Among Us, Haunted Missouri, and Paranormal Missouri. He lives with his family in Northwest Missouri, where he teaches journalism in college and keeps humanity safe from the forces of evil. He's here with us tonight to shed some more light on the very strange phenomena known as black-eyed kids. Jason, welcome to Beyond the Darkness.
Hey, thank you very much for having me back on. Back on. I really, had fun talking to you before, and I'm looking forward to tonight.
There are so many strange stories that are surfacing. Of course, we spent some time last week with David Weatherly, who's written the book on black-eyed children, and talked with demonologist Keith Johnson and Bishop Christina Rake about the possibility of possession and what could be leading these creatures to seek us out. And I wanted to take a different stance on this tonight. Joining us in the second half of tonight's show, noted alien abductee, author, researcher Whitley Strieber will join us. He's had a few very unsettling encounters with strange children. Is it part of the black-eyed phenomena? Is it alien-human hybrids? We'll explore that. But Jason, you've been doing this for quite a while, and you are, as I said, the first one that brought this story and these creatures to our attention. Are you amazed by how many more stories seem to be pouring out?
Yes and no. It kind of reminds me of when I wrote my book on shadow people. There weren't a lot of people other than Art Bell talking about these, and when I started to explore it, stories came just out of the woodwork. They just came from everywhere, and the same thing happened with these. Is when I started to explore this more. These stories just exploded, and I got to I've got the opinion that it's not that there are more stories, that the stories have increased, is that just people aren't afraid to talk about them anymore.
Do you think that there's a global consciousness awakening that may be energizing these beings, that the more people are experiencing it, the more they share their stories, perhaps it's waking them from some kind of supernatural slumber?
Well, now that, or whenever you talk about entities, whenever you give your attention to things, they tend to show up more. Whether these entities are showing up more, or something even darker than them is taking their visage. It reminds me of the Slender Man. I mean, that was a complete concoction. That was made up. But there have been a lot of Slender Man reports, and it could be some entities who are aware of this energy and this discussion, and they're appearing as the Slender Man. That might be with the black-eyed kids. There might be some there are definitely legitimate black-eyed kid encounters, but some black-eyed kid encounters might be entities posing as black-eyed kids just because of the attention that they've gotten.
All right. Now, I know we want to take a look at the skeptical side of this story as well. And I've had, over the years that we've been discussing this, so many quote-unquote armchair experts weigh in on this. Having never experienced one themselves, but only hearing these stories, we've had answers like, well, it's a medical condition. It's drugs. Or my two new favorites, well, you can get your eyes tattooed. Or it's probably kids just out wandering around with those black sclera eye contacts that they use for horror movies. Now, medical conditions, Jason, are there any real medical conditions that exist that would turn the entire eye black?
No,
Okay.
they're not. When I was researching an article that I wrote for Nexus Magazine, I explored all this. I spoke with biologists and doctors and pharmacists about medical conditions and drugs to see, because there are drugs that make the iris just explode in size, but there are no medical conditions or drugs that would cause it to cover the entire eye. The white is still going to be there. So medically or pharmacologically, that no, there's nothing that can do this. And about the contacts, I interviewed people who bought those, and I think two of the biggest things that make me believe that it's not people out there pulling pranks is that there's usually small children or young teenagers, and these contacts, at least when I wrote the article, were $300 a piece,
right,
per eye. And you had to have a prescription. You had to go in, and have your eye measured, and you had to have a prescription for it. So if it's somebody pulling a prank, it's a pretty darn expensive prank. And the people I talked to said that they're really uncomfortable to put in, and they pop out all the time. So if these black-eyed kids, some of them are as young as 6, 7, and a story I've got is a kid around 2. They're not going to be able to have those contact lenses in. There's no way.
Well, that's one of the issues we've had with it. When you have the other experts weighing in on this, saying that it's just kids out there screwing around. As you said, first of all, there's the expense. Secondly, most of the time this takes place in remote areas and late night hours. It seems that a majority of these stories take place. Hey, Tim and I are down with pranks. We love pranks. We love giving people a good scare. And I could see myself being involved in doing something fun to get people's attention and make them a little jittery. However, in the current day and age, Jason, of conceal and carry, and people toting guns and violence in the streets, I think the last thing I'm going to do is send my 7, 10, and 13-year-old out in the middle of the night with black sclera covering eye, contacts to play pranks on people. I'm pretty sure that's going to end up with one of my children or all of them in the hospital or in the morgue. So to me, that just seems like one of the most far-fetched examples. I'm not saying it's not possible, and that maybe a few of these, especially when you're looking at teenagers in the 16 and up category, could possibly have obtained these contacts. But again, I believe then those are the offshoots, and those are the one of a kind encounters, not so much these small gatherings of 2, 3, or 4 that we see and hear so much of.
Right, and I'm not saying that like you, that occasionally it might be a prank that somebody's pulling, but all the encounters that I've personally recorded, and that you mentioned David Weatherly and others who have. I mean, that it's not possible for all of them to be pranks. And it kind of, from what you said, reminds me of something that I was talking about during all the clown, the clown appearances.
Right.
They're showing up in North Carolina and Tennessee and in Missouri. I mean, there's a lot of rednecks with guns.
Yeah, there's a lot of white necks,
do that.
Black necks, yellow necks, and brown necks with guns too. You don't want to put yourself in these positions where somebody is going to maybe take a shot at you. And it's right. It's just, I think that is probably one of the more far-fetched aspects. Now, I do believe. After I need to clarify.
Right. I grew up in rural Missouri with gun owners, and I was not being derogatory toward rednecks.
No, I totally get that. But yeah, the one thing though that I find most off-putting about these stories is, like you, I understand there's going to be a subsection of people that want to involve themselves in the urban legend, and they want to have explored and made their name out there for having had a quote-unquote black-eyed kid experience. Some will have these eerie experiences with these children that seem out of place, out of time, that don't necessarily have the black eyes, or they didn't notice, but they still have the same weird mannerisms, bring up that sense of fear and dread in people, sometimes surrounded by a strange rotting meat or fecal smell. So there's this weird subset of that. But and I understand there are going to be some people that have faked and made up stories just to scare their friends. But as Tim and I have discussed, and we mentioned with David Weatherly last week, there have been some stories pouring in from around the world, from what I would consider very reliable sources. Does that mean that military personnel, law enforcement, and mom and pop wouldn't make up a fun story? Sure, there's always that possibility, but it's sometimes when you're engaging them in the story and they're telling you, and it's that glazed over post-traumatic stress disorder look on their face as they're describing to you what they saw, and you can physically see the fear and terror in their eyes. That really is what I find most off-putting about all of this.
Right, and having interviewed people about their encounters, Some stories I never wrote. I mean, I took notes when I interviewed the people, but I never wrote the stories up because I didn't believe them. And then the ones that I have written are people that I am 100% certain that they experienced something that they couldn't believe that scared the hell out of them.
Let's examine some of your favorite stories, some of the creepiest tales that you've collected over the years now that you've been researching the black-eyed children phenomena.
Well, the ones that really, really fascinate me involve children, little children, the littlest. I mean, and with the black-eyed kids, why appear as children? Well, children are fairly helpless. I mean, adults want to help children. So, if you're a predator, why not, why not look like that? Something, to get people's guard down. But I've interviewed a couple of people who've encountered small children that, and I mean, in this case, a guy named Jerry Davidson that I talked with, it was a relative of his. There was a niece of his. She was a blonde girl, blue eyes. Her skin was extremely pale, and even from a young age, this kid, would do things to just intentionally hurt the cat. Would seem to enjoy doing that. Other small relatives, as she was getting a little bit older, she would intentionally hurt the babies. She sent one of his nieces to the hospital with a broken arm. And the rest of the family discounted it as it was a complete accident. But Jerry stopped this kid from pushing a bookshelf over on an infant. People didn't see it. He was the one there, and he's the one that stopped it. But this child intentionally shoved the bookshelf over. And one time, he only saw this one time, but the girl had done something to another child, and then she started crying. The grandmother picked the baby up, and it was looking over the grandmother's shoulder. And Jerry was looking at the kid, and she smiled, and her eyes turned from blue to black, and completely black. And he said he described it as looking like a shark's eyes. The description that Quint gave in Jaws of the
Right.
dead shark's eyes. He said that's what it looked like, and the kid smiled at him, so he knew that the child knew what it was. And he got a divorce and wasn't around that part of the family because that was his wife's family, so he has no idea what happened to the kid. But he said that child was 4 years old when he got the divorce, and it absolutely terrified him.
Yikes. Now, again, that fits in with what we were discussing last week of the possibility of a child that's been cursed or possessed, and especially with the temporary view of the eyes turning completely black. That is a different version of the black-eyed kid phenomena. But again, we don't know. Are these normal kids that were out playing, doing something, and a force took them over? Is this an alien interference, and they're using these children, like you said, to get into the home, to get the person to follow them somewhere where they can secure them for abduction or whatever? That's where it gets chilling. So we don't know if the eyes revert back to normal or change over, or if this is their constant look.
Well, it could be either thing. That's one of the things that I'm fascinated by this phenomenon, because it could be a lot of different things. I was contacted by a man who called himself Dracos. This has been a number of years ago, and it really unnerved me. He was claiming he was an adult, and he was claiming to be a black-eyed person, and he said that what we are is a race in the shadows. What we are goes back to the book of Genesis. We are the product of the serpent mating with Eve. And there aren't many of us, but we are human. We look human. We live among you. And we're just waiting until we grow enough in numbers, and that humans have persecuted them over the millennia, keeping their numbers small. And I'm just like,
Wow.
What? Really? This is pretty wow. Never heard this before. I found this extremely creepy.
Extremely creepy and unsettling for sure. Very, very weird angles. We're talking again, Jason Offutt, our guest, as we're discussing the strange encounters with black-eyed children. Let's hear another one of your favorites.
Another one of my favorites also has to do with a child. I talked with a guy, and he was remembering a story of when he was younger, and his family had lived in the city, and they moved to a house out in the country. And it was kind of a neighborhood. There were a few houses around you could see from your backyard. It wasn't backyard to backyard, but it was close enough. About a half mile away. But anyway, they got to the house. His parents were unpacking. He was about 5, and he had some pet rabbits in a hutch that they put behind a shed in the backyard. And his parents were unpacking, and he wanted to go swing on a swing set because the family that lived there before had kids and left their swing set. And he ran out of the house, and there was a little girl in a dress sitting on a swing. And he thought, great, there's another kid in the neighborhood that I can play with. She's about my age. And he walked up to her, and the first thing he noticed was a stench. And it was the stench of death that he smelled. And he tried to talk to her, and she wouldn't say anything. And he said that remembering back at 5, her eyes were just dead black. And she would never talk to him, but she finally, she was completely no emotions, but she finally smiled at him. And when she opened her mouth, her teeth were like needles. And he just shrieked and ran back into the house and didn't he ran into the house and laid on the couch screaming, and he was inconsolable for a while and didn't want to go outside for at least a week. But he does remember the next day his father went out to feed the rabbits, and the rabbits the door was open and the rabbits had been torn to shreds. So he's convinced that the little girl that he saw one time had taken care of his rabbits.
Now that's one of the rare encounters where the children don't just seem to fade away or leave once you've ignored them and you haven't allowed them in or whatever. This is a more violent attribute. Is that part of the storyline now? Are you hearing more that seem to retaliate?
Actually, no. This is one of the rare ones. Generally, the black-eyed kids, after an encounter, they disappear. I did talk with a guy in Pennsylvania. It was not really a retaliation physically, but it was a retaliation mentally. He'd visited a friend of his at a town about an hour away from his house, and his friend lived in an apartment complex, and he after a few hours of hanging out with his buddy, he went to the went out to the parking garage of the apartment complex and was fumbling with the keys. It was really cold. He was trying to get in his car, and he noticed a couple of teenagers approaching him, and he thought it was, one, it was like 1 o'clock in the morning, and he was in a parking garage by himself. So that bothered him on one level, but another level is that they were wearing clothes and hats with the sports logo of a team that hadn't existed for like 20 years, but they looked brand new. And, that kind of thought he thought that was odd. Yeah. And as they started to approach him, he got the door open and climbed in the car, and he rolled the window a little down a little bit because they were knocking on the door and they were asking for a ride. And that's when he noticed, the typical thing with the black-eyed kids is the smell. And the panic he felt in his chest as they were just near, and then he noticed their eyes, and he tore out of there. When he looked back, just a lot like Brian Bethel's, description. I know you guys talked about that with David Weatherly. They were gone when he looked in his rearview mirror, and he sped out of the parking garage, sped a couple of blocks, and there was a street light. It was red, so he stopped. And he turned over because he noticed something felt wrong, and he turned over to his right, and these same kids were standing on the street corner staring at him. And he ran the red light, and he sped all the way home. But that's that's a rare case. Generally, after you deny the black-eyed kids entrance, they they disappear, but it does happen.
Have you started to receive any stories of survivors that have accidentally let them in without realizing what it is that they're dealing with?
I've only talked to one person, and I was beginning, and I still feel this way. I still feel this way. A guy I'd interviewed a number of times. His name was Mac Tonys. I don't know if you recognize the name. He wrote the book on crypto-terrestrials. But he was from Kansas City, Missouri, which is I'm from that area, and so I interviewed him a couple of times about various things, and he died of natural causes in his early 30s. You don't die from natural causes in your early 30s, but it was stuff like this that I'm wondering, is this what happens when you let black-eyed kids in the house? Do you die at 34 years old of natural causes on your couch? So, I mean, it's most of the time people don't let them in. The only time I ever talked to somebody who did let a black-eyed kid in and lived to tell about it was a group of teenagers. There was a knock on the door, and they opened the door, and there was a boy out there who was dressed oddly. He was dressed in not old clothes, but old-fashioned clothes, maybe 20 years out of date. And he has to come in. He just wanted a drink of water. I want a drink of water, and then I want to call my mom. And there was like 5 teenagers there, and they're like, sure, come on in. And even though he had completely black eyes, one of them described it as, being filled with ink. They let him in and sat him in the kitchen because that's where they got him a glass of water, and that's where the phone was. And they offered him a sandwich. They offered him a soda. He didn't want anything. He just wanted to sit there and wait till it was time to call his mother. And they went on about their business, and they'd keep occasionally peek in there. And the kid hadn't moved. He hadn't touched his water either. And eventually one of them walked in there and asked him what he was doing. And he got up, walked out the back door, and walked out the back door of the back deck, and disappeared. And the back door of the back deck had no steps. It was like 10 feet off the ground. And they rushed out there, and the kid was just gone.
When you hear stories like this and you're looking at all of the different aspects of these tales, have you started to put together a theory on what it is we're really dealing with? Or do you think there could be multi-races of these beings that exist?
It's when it comes to things of the paranormal, I don't think there is ever one answer. Are these entities possessed? Are they demonic? I've interviewed experts in Islam, and I interviewed a Catholic exorcist, and they both described somebody being demon possessed, having they can have eyes like that, they can behave like this. I interviewed a woman who was convinced that it was an extraterrestrial hybrid that she saw that had these black, shark-like eyes. It could be a lot of different things. So I'm not going to pin it down to one thing. It could be all of them.
One of the most fascinating aspects of this story, and which leads us to our next guest, Whitley Strieber, is the idea that these could be alien-human hybrids. So many abductees tell stories of awakening on a ship or somewhere unknown to them in a lab-like setting where they're being harvested, either their eggs or semen, and they're acutely aware that they've been impregnated or that they've been a part of creating another force. When we hear about these stories of black-eyed kids, it has led to an interesting theory or hypothesis, if you will, that these creatures, because they are genetically engineered, the one thing they're missing is a soul. And are they going to try to collect the soul of the people they visit? We've heard 2 stories in the last 5 years from people that believe that their family members encountered the black-eyed kids. And playing off of what you discussed, having one get in, the first story we heard was from actually a gentleman that was in jail and listened to our show, Darkness Radio. He said that his only kind of remaining family member that was close with him was his grandfather, who was very strong, very, acutely healthy. Everything was good with him. One day while he was talking to his grandfather, while he was in prison, the grandfather said, "Hold on, somebody's at the door." He could hear this grandfather talking to these kids, and the grandfather was getting a little gruff with him and shut the door. And he came back and he said, "These weird kids, they want to come in, they want to, help out around the place. I've never seen them before." Goes back to talking, and suddenly he starts hearing the knocking and banging again. And he goes, "You know what, let me go take care of these kids. I'll talk to you again in a few days." That night, the grandfather passed away. Healthy as can be, no issues. And suddenly, after having a weird encounter where there are kids that are being persistent trying to get into the home, the grandfather's gone. Another one very similar, grandmother, same situation, as they're talking to their grandmother on the phone. Kids are knocking at the door. The grandmother leaves to go answer the door and comes back and says, "There are these kids. I think something's wrong. They're very strange. They seem very despondent. I'm going to go see what they need and how I can help them." And again, just had that kind of strange nuances the family could hear over the phone, this kind of monotone conversation going on between these children trying to come in and get help. The grandmother hangs up and the next day is found dead of course, natural causes. So the question is, are these alien human hybrids harvesting the souls of those that are about to pass, or perhaps taking the souls of people that they need in order to maintain or start their own humanity? It's something to consider, and it's definitely making the story even a little bit more chilling, in my opinion.
Well, yeah, that's extremely creepy. But I mean, if you think about it, everything has to feed. My MacBook that I'm looking at, staring at right now, is feeding off of electricity. I had tater tot casserole for dinner. It was delicious. Everything has to feed. What do these things feed off of? Do they feed off soul energy? Yeah, I've talked to enough people who've experienced them that I'm thinking that might be part of it. Which, yeah, again, that is absolutely terrifying, because where do you go after your soul is devoured?
Well, that's the thought we'll leave everyone with. Jason, thank you again for joining us, and we'll look forward to talking with you again in the future with more Black-Eyed Kids, Shadow People, and Creepy Encounters.
That is terrific. Thanks. I had a great time being on the show. I appreciate your invitation.
Well, from the chilling true tales collected by Jason Offutt to listeners' encounters, it's time now to turn to the Darchives for the next installment of Theater of the Mind. Terror in the Hallways. A true encounter from Gail Brereton. Gail Brereton of Toronto in Ontario, Canada, is certain Black-Eyed Kids are extraterrestrial and are bent on indoctrination and assimilation. Brereton took her daughter to elementary school when she encountered a boy she was sure was not from this world. "My first encounter with an alien was at my daughter's school," she said. Brereton saw the small boy walking through the lonely school hallway alone. "I looked at him. In a funny way, I passed, thinking, wait, I should alert someone of him being alone. Maybe he wandered off," Brereton said. As she neared the child, a teacher poked her head out of the classroom, and Brereton asked, "Would you like me to go get him?" The teacher said, "Yes, please." When Brereton got within 10 steps of the child, he slowed. Her muscles froze, and she stopped dead in her tracks. At this moment, he looked at me, and that was the ugliest child I had ever seen, she said. His head was misshapen and funny, and it was as if he was transforming right in front of my eyes. And that's when I noticed. I stared deep into his jet black eyes. There was no white in his eyes, and he was a pale white person, extremely chalky white and pale. She stood immobile in the hall, just watching the boy as he walked to the end of the hall. As soon as he got to the end of the hallway, I heard the words come out loudly. "Come here," she said. I had said that a couple seconds before. Suddenly, Brereton couldn't move again, and she dashed down the hall. But when she rounded the corner, the boy had vanished. The teacher came out, and she asked me where he went to. I said he just disappeared. A head count showed every child in the school accounted for. The ugly little boy was a mystery. All day I kept feeling like the pace had slowed for me in that moment, and I could not get back to regular speed. Everything seemed like it was moving
at the wrong speed.
Brereton knows that something sinister is happening in the public school system. This is the true account of what had happened to her. Aliens are here, but God alone knows what they want in our kids' schools, she said. And what a fine place for them to intertwine and grow into our society without the risk of being exposed.
Up next, experiencer Whitley Strieber joins us as he talks about his stories and possible encounter with what could be a black-eyed kid. It lies just ahead, Beyond the Darkness.
Listening to Beyond the Darkness. I'm your host, Dave Schrader, along with me, Tim Dennis. We've been exploring for the last 2 weeks the phenomenon known as the black-eyed kids. Last week, we heard from David Weatherly. We also spoke with Bishop Christina Rake and demonologist Keith Johnson about the possibilities that these creatures may come from a darker realm, from the demonic world. Now, this evening we've spent talking with Jason Offutt, who has different perspectives on this, as we've just heard. Joining us for the remainder of tonight's show, it's a real privilege to have him here with us. Whitley Strieber is one of today's most influential and best-selling authors of both science fiction and extraordinary fact. He is best known for his groundbreaking memoir, Communion, which popularized the alien abduction thesis, as well as many best-selling novels such as The Wolfen and The Hunger. These and other of Strieber's books have formed the basis for many popular movies, including The Day After Tomorrow. He's here to talk to us about a very strange encounter that he had. Whitley, thank you for joining us on Beyond the Darkness today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Talking about this phenomena, the strange visitations by these children that have dead black eyes, the entire sclera blacked out. Very strange encounters people have, usually in the fact where they only hear one or two of them will actually talk. The others just stand silently in the background. This is something that sounds like it's right out of a horror movie. And we've talked about it from the ghostly and demonic side and the possibility of could it be some form of weird cryptid. Now, can you tell us a little bit about the experience you had? When did this happen to you?
This happened in about 1989, 88 or 89. And my son, as a little boy at the time, was playing in the front yard with a friend in our cabin. We had a cabin. It was a fairly isolated area and had a dirt road going past it. It was a private road, so there was never any cars on it or anything like that. And the kids came in and said there was something strange going on, that there was a strange-looking boy on a bicycle staring at them from the roadside. And so I stepped out on the porch, and what I saw was a boy straddling a bicycle. He looked to be maybe 12 or so, and he was very pale, absolutely almost chalk white, had very dark black hair, and he was wearing a very extremely unusual shirt. It had knife blades sticking out of it all over the surface of the front of it. It was very ominous and creepy. I never saw him. He was just staring at the house. I started to walk toward him. He got on the bicycle, or he sat back up on the seat, and began to ride down the hill that he was standing on. At the bottom of that hill, there was a turn to the left, and the road went on for a brief distance, but not very far, perhaps 500 feet. And then it ended in a thick woods and was surrounded by a thick woods. And I believe I may have called out to him, but he was riding away, and I really wanted to know what was going on. So I went down and turned the corner. There was nobody there. The bicycle was gone, so was the little boy. And there was no place for him to have gone. If he had ridden into the woods, he would have been off the bicycle, and I would have still been able to see him moving through the trees. I went back to the house, and unfortunately, that's the end of the story. We never saw him again. But he was there. And then years later, of course, this was many years later, people began to talk about these black-eyed children. And there seemed to me to be some sort of a connection. Largely, I didn't see his eyes, but he was just so pale. He was very unusual looking. In that shirt, it was really one of the most ominous things I've ever seen. That was what caused me to be concerned and to go after him, because I didn't think that it was normal for a child to be wearing something like that, and I did not care to have him near my own child and other children that were in our care.
Understandable. Now, when you saw this boy, did it have any physical reaction? A lot of people that have encountered these strange children have felt revulsed or almost nauseous. They've had a physical and psychological effect on them. Did that happen to you at all, or were you just more trying to figure out who it was and what they were doing there and why they were there with your kids?
Nothing like that happened. The children went inside, and I never brought it up with them again, and they seemed unbothered. And I did not experience anything like that. What I did experience was concern that this child was there, and I felt, after all, I mean, we'd had the communion experience in that cabin, and at that point in time, the visitors were showing up. They were often with big groups of people at the cabin, so, it wasn't as if we weren't aware of strange things going on.
Right.
But this was unusually creepy, I have to tell you, although I didn't experience any nausea or anything like that.
When the visitors would make themselves known to you, was there ever, like an aura, was there ever some kind of precursor to let you know that there was something coming, or was it always by surprise when they made their appearance?
No, there were two precursors that were very common. The first one was when we had a group of people up at the cabin. If someone saw a dead friend or relative in the afternoon or early evening, it meant the visitors would be there that night, always. That was basic. And the other thing was that when they would approach, things would get very quiet, silent. And, for example, the night before I had my first conscious close encounter in December of '85, my wife and son and I took a walk, and it was snowing, and it was just so very silent, and it was absolutely beautiful, and the light was just fading away, and it was just early evening, probably about 5 o'clock, I guess, that time of year. And the snowflakes were all large individual crystals, like you see in a microscope when you look at snowflakes. They're so beautiful. They were like that, but they were all very large, and it was just an absolutely magical moment. And then there was another time, an evening before they came, when I was outside and was walking back to the house, and it was dark. And as I walked to the house, I noticed that the lights were on in the windows, but they were shining in such a way that they shone out in two directions. In other words, there was a shadow of the window on the grass on the left and also one on the right, and that can't happen. So I knew they would show up that night because things were too weird for them not to.
And when you would see these creatures, and were they the stature of children? Were some of them that stature, or how can you explain to us? Very small.
I wasn't the one who saw them so much. Other people tended to see them. I really haven't seen them that often. I saw them the night of the close encounter in 1985, and I subsequently just glimpsed them a few times. But they would come up to the house, and people would see them and would actually interact with them. Raven Dana, Laurie Barnes, two people who have gone on record about what happened to them there. Other friends who had similar experiences, who do not wish to be known. So it was a little annoying in a way that I was the one who was doing all the work and, going out in the woods in the middle of the night with my heart in my mouth all alone. The visitors were responding, but they never came to me. They always came to other people. They came to me a few times, and it's not totally. But not the way I'm thinking now. I'm thinking now when they would come in a totally physical way to a person who was wide awake. That is not what happened to me often. That happened once or twice, but not often. Mostly when I had encounters, they would either be extremely brief in the woods, sometimes very extraordinary, but still really brief, or they would happen. It would be something that I would be waked up, but it wouldn't be like it happened to some of the other people when it was a more, I would say, I had a more atmosphere of a more ordinary experience for them. But, I don't know what the visitors are even now. That's still a very open question for me. For example, there was a lot of evidence that they were coming up out of the ground around that cabin, not from above. I'm really a big questioner of the alien hypothesis, I have to tell you.
You're not a big proponent of it being?
I'm a big questioner of the alien hypothesis.
Okay.
I'm not really willing to say these are aliens. I don't know what they are.
When you hear about these black-eyed kid experiences, they seem to want to get into the home. They want you to follow them somewhere, get into your vehicle.
Yeah.
Does this mesh at all with any kind of alien experiences that they need permission, or they're trying to get invited in for these kind of connections?
What's similar in some ways is the sense of the sinister that's there. I've had that with the visitors all my time with them in my adult life, and I've just come to accept that it's part of the way they are, and I live with it. They never hurt me. And if anything, my relationship with them now is closer than it's ever been. And as I say, they're still just as creepy as they were when I first met them, but they don't hurt me, and I get a lot out of it, so I just keep going.
I'm sorry, I thought that at one point they had hurt you quite harshly. Am I misunderstanding that?
No, you're not misunderstanding me.
Okay.
The first experience in December of '85 was a mess. I was beat up badly. I got hurt. And there was a couple of other things that happened over the years that have been difficult physically. But for the most part, it's scary without being physically challenging. Like it is now. It can be very scary now, but it's never physically challenging. There's no sense of anything going to come up the side of my head or anything like that.
Okay. Now that brings up an interesting point. We've heard a lot of these experiences that sometimes end in a form of molestation, where women feel as though they have had intrusion, they've had eggs perhaps harvested, men feel that they've had semen harvested, and when we start hearing about these cases, it makes you start to wonder, are we dealing with some form of hybridization? And again, like you, maybe I won't say necessarily alien in nature, but definitely something is meshing with another species of some sort.
Well, something's going on there.
Mm-hmm.
I would never be the one to deny that, because I have seen that and had that in my life. What happened in this regard was, right before we were going to leave the cabin, I guess must have then been there for about 94 or 95, I was out in the woods on a very hot August afternoon, and our woods were on a hill, and up at the top of this hill there's a grove of what are called pitch pines, which are extremely flammable trees. They're pines that you get pitch out of. So when they get dry, they can explode. And I saw what looked like a little boy under an oak tree, actually, smoking a cigarette. He looked about 12 or 13, 11. And I thought, that's not good. A child, first of all, out in my woods smoking, I don't want that. Second, clearly it's dangerous. So I went over to him, and I started to lean over to him and say to him, I think I'd like you to put that out and leave my property. And he just stared straight ahead, and he made this low kind of growling noise. I was well out in the woods, And I thought, well, maybe I actually don't want to be here anymore. I'm just going to get out of here. Because he didn't, up close, look right. He looked like I'll tell you, it's hard to explain. He looked like a person who had reached the age of 11 and stopped aging and maturing, but kept getting older. He was weathered, a weathered 11-year-old, if you can imagine that.
No, I've totally got the picture you're painting on this.
Well, you can understand then when I decided to get out of there, I went back to the house immediately. But then he started, we could smell the cigarette smoke all the time at the house, and we found places in the woods where there were hundreds of cigarette butts in piles. He was out there living in those woods. And he would come up to the house at night. He would, once Annie and I used to go skinny dipping in our pool. It was very private. And we were skinny dipping one evening when he shows up in the woods behind the pool, and there's a lot of shrubs. You can't see him. But behind the shrubs, there's sort of an open area under the branches of the trees. And he's running back and forth in there, cracking branches and gasping and going on. We went inside. We were creeped out.
Yeah, understandable.
Try to skinny dip under those circumstances.
No.
So
that's an intimidating enough kind of thing to do than having some kind of creepy visitor out there watching you do this.
Yeah, well, exactly. And yet he seemed to be kind of wanting to protect us, you know. He seemed to be a bit of a guardian. And there had been some trouble with the local people. I'd been threatened. My life had been threatened a number of times because word was getting around in that community, and those were simple people. These were not educated people, and these were people who were thinking, you know, he's some kind of black magician or a witch, or he's got demons in his place, because some of the people who worked for me had seen things in there, and the word was getting around in the community. So I was definitely not a wanted presence in that community, that's for certain. So in any case, we lost our money, and we had to leave because people stopped buying my books, and we lost the cabin, and we left, and we moved to a condominium in San Antonio, which is my hometown, because we already owned the little condo. My mother had lived in it, so it was shelter for us. You know, we could go there. And we hadn't been living there for a month before that kid, or whatever he was, showed up. And we start to smell cigarette smoke in the apartment. It's on the ground floor. And immediately outside the head of the bed is a little cul-de-sac. There's a screen porch that ends, and then beyond that, there's about a 5 or 6 foot wall, and it's a cul-de-sac. And I realize he's standing at night in that cul-de-sac, as close to us as he can be. He's come from, somehow or another, from upstate New York.
Now,
and
if I could ask you one thing, Whitley, when we talked last week with Keith Johnson, the demonologist, and Reverend Mother Christina Rake, we had talked about the fact that in some cases demons will take on forms that are recognizable, but they're usually something off-putting, something strange. And like you're acknowledging, this looked like a very young child that had stopped developing but managed to continue to age, yet keep that kind of creepy, youthful look. Do you think one of two things? Could this have been perhaps a man in black keeping an eye on you and the visitors? Or do you believe this might have been one of the visitors taking on a form that would be less obvious to anyone else in the area, but still letting you know that they were keeping tabs on you?
Well, you know, I'm not a believer in the old religions. I got past that. Demons and stuff. I don't think it's real. I think we've got something here that's been with us for a long time, and is probably as much a part of the universe around us as it is a part of us, that we just don't understand yet. And there's a tendency when you confront something like that to think, well, it must be something evil. But it's really just, I think, more likely that it's strange. And So I don't really think in terms of, oh my God, it must be a demon or something. What I did think in terms of was, A, I did not like my bedroom filled with cigarette smoke at night. And B, I did not want someone standing 4 feet from my head all night, because I had become aware of the fact that he could read minds. And I did not want that invasion of my privacy. Or Anne's, either. I mean, but she wasn't bothered. She was on the other side of the room, so she wasn't so bothered by it. So I installed an automatic light, movement-sensitive light in the cul-de-sac. And then at the same time that this happened, we were out walking, and we saw 2 men standing in front of a strip mall as we came home, 2 o'clock in the morning. We used to walk at 2 o'clock in the morning because it was so hot there, very hot. And these men, it was one man actually, he just exuded this sense of evil. He was really pretty creepy. And then I saw him again in the condo complex and realized he was living in the apartment behind us. And so was another equally creepy man and this strange being. They were living in there right behind us. And I thought to myself, I can't believe they could have rented this. These people are very marginal at best. So I telephoned. I found from the condo management the name of the owner of the apartment and telephoned him. And he said, "There's no one lives there. I use it when I come up to San Antonio. It's empty." I said, "It's not empty. There's 3 people living in it," and I described them. So he telephoned the sheriff's office, and they sent a bailiff out there to evict him and put up an eviction notice and everything. And the next thing we knew, 2 things happened. People in the condo complex started calling social services because this boy was wandering around the complex doing strange things. Like they found him up on a 2nd-story balcony, methodically pulling the spokes out of somebody's bicycle wheel. And another man saw him jump off of a balcony into the swimming pool, which was impossible because he hopped out like a frog. You need to take a run to do that.
Right.
And so then, after the eviction notice was put up, the 2 men go around the condo complex knocking on doors trying to sell the guy's furniture that's in his apartment.
Jeez.
And the next thing I know, they're gone, and suddenly one morning while I'm working in our little garden, which is on the street, the kid marches out from between the buildings with a cigarette between his fingers and between his middle finger and his the middle finger and the 3rd finger, and I thought, that poor kid is smoking so young. He doesn't even know how to smoke, and he jams a cigarette into his mouth like he's heard me, and goes striding off down the street. And I never saw him again. And I don't think that was a demon. I think that was somebody in trouble. Somebody's got something wrong with them, something really wrong with them. And those 2 men were the same. There was something wrong with those people. Whether they were hybrids or what the hell they were, I don't know. But they were certainly screwed up, that's for sure.
Well, obviously, but then that the kid had the ability to follow you from one part of the United States to a completely different state and know where you're at and show up again. Very unnerving.
It's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
And it implies that when I say there was something screwy about him, I'm talking about a big screwy. It's not a small screwy. It's a big, major screwy.
Could I ask you, Whitley, real quickly, as we're wrapping up here on this, when you talked about the child that you saw outside your cabin and the kind of out of place, out of time look to him, this super pale white skin, strange shirt, and then he vanishes. I know in a lot of cases of alien abduction or visitors, there is this time loss phenomena where people will suddenly lose an hour or 2, sometimes up to 4 or 5 hours of their life. They have no memory or recollection of what happened.
Yes.
we've also heard of time slip phenomena, which we're starting to understand and maybe attributing to things more of the paranormal ilk, ghosts and other items that maybe we're just seeing through a window in time, a brief shutter, if you will, shade going up for a moment and allows us to see this. Do you think that cabin area might have been seated in a ley line or vortex portal type area where there was many different type of phenomena that might have been going on and kind of opening up the opportunity to see visitors, time slip, and so on?
Well, my wife Ann felt that time and derangements of time had a lot to do with all of this. And, it's a huge, complex universe, and we know very little about it. And I don't just mean the physical universe that we see. We are pretty sure now that there are parallel universes out there that are, I say out there, that are right here, that are proceeding according to different laws of physics than this one. And, they could be bleeding over one way or another. We could go back and forth. It could be that the barrier between these universes isn't as absolutely solid as you might think. And it could also be that there are beings in parallel universes who know how to get around in ways that we don't. Because the physics of it is this. Making something like a wormhole between one part of this universe and another part takes an absolutely fantastic amount of energy as far as we understand it. But if you want to make one between this universe and a parallel universe, if something like that exists, the amount of energy is very comprehensible. It's not impossible to do that. And that would mean, inevitably, if there are a lot of them, some of them contain beings that know how to do that. It's statistically inevitable. So maybe that's the answer.
Whitley, we can't thank you enough for your time this evening. I thank you for joining us, opening up to us, and giving us some of your insight on this very weird phenomenon. We'll look forward to talking to you again in the future on Beyond the Darkness. Thank you all for spending your time here with us. We hope that you have a safe and happy New Year's Eve. Please be kind to one another. Start off the year in a bright new way. Next week, we will return when we turn our views to shadow people encounters. Some of the most bizarre and in some cases aggressive shadow people encounters. We'll be doing that on January 2nd. And I want to thank Chris Jericho and the good people at Podcast One for bringing us to you. We hope that you enjoy the show as much as we enjoy bringing it to you. And remember, you can follow us on social media. We're Beyond the Darkness Show on Facebook. That's Beyond the Darkness Show on Facebook, or at Beyond Dark Show on Twitter. At Beyond Dark Show on Twitter. And while you're at it, if you're going to subscribe to the show, you like what you hear, do us a favor, go on to iTunes and make sure that you rate it, review it, and let everybody else know about it. Share the darkness with the rest of the world. That's our quest, and we hope that you'll join us in that. All right, we'll be back again with you right after the beginning of the new year. For Tim Dennis, I'm Dave Schrader. Special thanks to Jason Offutt and Whitley Strieber. This is Beyond the Darkness.